Implementing the Advice-Only Methodology, CFP Board CE. Welcome everyone to Implementing the Advice-Only Methodology. In this session, we're going to examine advice-only not as a pricing label or service tier, but as a structural fiduciary design, a system built so that recommendations can stand on their own. The argument is simple. Fiduciary duty is not primarily a moral issue. It's a design problem. The core question isn't whether advisors are good people. The question is whether the systems they work inside make it easy or difficult to act in a client's best interest. Advice only is a structural response to that design problem. Today, I'll walk you through how it works, what it prohibits, and why its structure matters more than its terminology. In practice, this design problem shows up in very ordinary decisions: mortgage payoffs, asset retention, share class selection, withdrawal timing. These are not abstract ethical debates. They are incentive structures embedded in advisory systems. And once you begin evaluating those systems rather than individual intent, the analysis changes. This course is titled Implementing the Advice-Only Methodology in Financial Planning. It is a 1-hour continuing education program approved for CFP Board General CE credit. The instructional portion of this course is designed to run approximately 1 hour, with time reserved separately for assessment and reporting. This program is educational. It is not a sales presentation. It does not promote any particular firm or platform. It is designed to help you understand how fiduciary duty actually operates in a real advisory practice. Most advisors care deeply about their clients. Most want to do the right thing. But caring is not the same as being protected from conflicts, and that is what this course is about. Many advisors believe that being a good person is enough to satisfy fiduciary duty. But being a good person is a standard of conduct, not a delivery system. If you are a good person working inside a system that pays you more to keep a mortgage active than to pay it off, you are living in a structural conflict that no amount of virtue can fully erase. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to do 3 things. Recognize structural conflicts that persist even when disclosed. Understand what I call the capability lens, which evaluates what a system is actually capable of producing. And see how the advice-only methodology attempts to engineer fiduciary reliability rather than merely promise it. This raises a practical question. Why do conflicts of interest exist even in firms that disclose them? Why do regulators continue to find violations in firms that are technically compliant? Why do clients so often feel that advice and sales are tangled together, even when everyone says they are separate? The answer is that fiduciary duty lives inside business systems, and business systems have incentives. If the system isn't built to support fiduciary duty, the duty will eventually fail under pressure. This is not a criticism of any individual advisor. It is an observation about how systems work. That brings us to what I call the two masters problem. The two masters problem occurs when a financial advisor is expected to act in the best interest of the client while also being compensated in a way that depends on what the client does with their money. In other words, the advisor serves two masters, the client and the firm's revenue model. Let me say that another way. The advisor is not just giving advice. The advisor is also working inside a business that makes more money when clients do certain things and less money when they do other things. That is not an accusation. That is just how businesses work. But it matters. It matters a great deal. Under the CFP Board Code of Ethics and Standards of Conduct, fiduciary duty requires us to act in the best interest of the client at all times when providing financial advice. This isn't just a suggestion. It is a mandate of loyalty, care, and obedience. However, we must make a critical distinction. Fiduciary duty is a standard of conduct, not a delivery system. It defines how an advisor is expected to behave, but it does not define how advice must be structured, compensated, or operationalized in practice. This is where the two masters problem enters the picture. What this reveals is structural friction, the tension that arises when advice is expected to remain neutral inside systems economically tied to implementation. Let's walk through a simple example. Imagine a retired client with $700,000 in a taxable brokerage account and a $250,000 mortgage at 6% interest. From a planning standpoint, paying off that mortgage might be one of the smartest financial moves the client can make. It lowers monthly expenses by eliminating a mortgage payment. It reduces risk because the client no longer has that debt obligation. And it provides a guaranteed return equal to the mortgage rate, 6% in this case. Now imagine that same client working with a firm that charges 1% of assets under management. If the client uses $250,000 to pay off the mortgage, the firm loses $2,500 a year in revenue. Every single year. Forever. No one has to say that out loud. The system knows. The spreadsheet knows. The revenue projection knows. So now ask yourself, what kinds of recommendations will that system be naturally better at making? Will it be naturally good at recommending debt payoffs that reduce assets? Or will it be naturally good at recommending strategies that keep assets invested? The system has a gravitational pull toward keeping assets under management. This directional bias, the gravitational pull toward asset retention, is what I call implementation interference. It is a property of the system, not the person. That is the two masters problem. And it's not limited to mortgage payoffs. Let me give you another example. A client in their early 60s has a large traditional IRA. A careful tax analysis shows that converting portions of that IRA to a Roth over the next several years would significantly reduce lifetime taxes. These conversions would take advantage of lower tax brackets before Social Security begins and before required minimum distributions start. But Roth conversions require paying taxes out of the IRA, which reduces the account balance. In an asset-based model, that reduction lowers revenue. In an advice-only model, it does not. Same client, same advisor, same financial situation. Different systems, different pressures, different outcome probabilities. We can describe this dynamic as implementation interference, the structural distortion that occurs when an advisor's economic relationship to implementation begins shaping the recommendations themselves. This is not simply bias or intent. It is systemic pressure embedded in advisory architecture. The math may point toward asset reduction, simplification, or debt elimination, while the revenue model quietly favors the opposite outcome. That is not about ethics. That is about design. The advisor in the first scenario might genuinely want to do what's best for the client, but they're potentially being asked to recommend something that will permanently lower their own income. That's a design flaw, not a character flaw. And this is why disclosure alone does not solve the problem. The central issue is not whether advisors want to act in the best interest, but whether the system they operate within supports that outcome consistently and reliably. If this sounds theoretical, it isn't. The SEC has repeatedly found that disclosure alone does not neutralize conflicts when a firm's systems are still designed to produce specific outcomes. In a widely cited enforcement action involving revenue sharing and mutual fund share class selection, the SEC found that a firm disclosed it may receive revenue sharing compensation, yet still failed its duty of care. The failure was not the absence of disclosure. The failure was the design of the system itself. The firm's share class selection process, supervision, and compensation structure made higher cost outcomes more likely, even when lower-cost equivalent share classes were available to clients. The SEC's conclusion was clear. Disclosure documents the existence of a conflict. It does not neutralize a system that is built to reward a particular result. Conflicts do not disappear in low-cost, fee-only, or well-intentioned firms. They migrate into different parts of the system. This is why fiduciary duty under the CFP Board standards is framed as a duty of loyalty and care, not merely a duty of disclosure. For decades, regulators have tried to manage conflicts through disclosure. The idea is that if clients are informed, they can protect themselves. The theory is elegant. The execution has proven insufficient. But disclosure does not remove incentives. It just tells clients they exist. Disclosure informs the client that a conflict exists, but it does not eliminate the conflict itself. The system continues to operate exactly as before. A firm can disclose that it is paid based on assets under management. That disclosure might be clear, prominent, and repeated, but that does not change the fact that keeping assets invested is still how the firm makes money. The incentive remains embedded in the revenue model. A firm can disclose that it receives payments from product providers, commissions, revenue sharing, or other forms of compensation. But that does not change the fact that those payments still influence what gets recommended, what gets featured in presentations, and what gets described as suitable or appropriate for clients. This is why regulators keep bringing enforcement actions against firms that technically disclose their conflicts but still misled clients about how advice was shaped. Disclosure documents the conflict. It does not neutralize it. It does not remove the pressure. I want to pause here and make sure this point lands, because this is where many well-intentioned advisors get stuck. When I say disclosure doesn't neutralize conflicts, I mean that the incentive structure remains in place. The advisor still faces the same pressures. The system still rewards the same behaviors. The only difference is that now the client has been told about it. Think of it this way. If I tell you that I'm standing on a steep slope and gravity is pulling me downhill, that disclosure doesn't change gravity. I'm still being pulled. The force is still there. I might be trying very hard to stand still, but the slope hasn't changed. The angle hasn't changed. The pull hasn't changed. Disclosure is transparency about the problem, not a solution to it. Regulatory enforcement actions consistently demonstrate that disclosure alone does not neutralize conflicted advice. In multiple cases over the past several years, firms have disclosed conflicts accurately while continuing to operate compensation and promotion systems tied to enrollment, retention, or asset control. When enforcement followed, it was not because disclosure was absent. It was because disclosure proved insufficient to protect clients from the systematic influence of those conflicts. The presence of ongoing financial incentives tied to implementation or retention divides loyalty between client and firm, no matter how many times that division is disclosed. I want to pause here because this is where a common misunderstanding begins. When people hear that a system has removed commissions or does not sell products, they often assume the fiduciary problem has been solved. But that is not true. Eliminating sales does not eliminate the two masters problem if the system still pushes clients toward a predetermined outcome, including assuming an implementation posture at the outset. A model that presumes a specific implementation path, including DIY, before analysis is just as outcome biased as a model that presumes product sales. Implementation neutrality is not the same as client capability. Advice only does not presume clients will or will not self-execute. It presumes only that advice must be formed independently of that outcome. The two masters problem is not about sales versus no sales. It is about who controls financial outcomes. Advice only is not simply advice without products. It is advice produced inside a system that is structurally insulated from business and financial incentives, not from professional judgment. The advisor retains full responsibility for evaluating what is realistic, what is risky, and what will not work. Self-implementation may be one viable option among several, but it is never the model itself. But let's be honest, this does not make advice-only advisors infallible. It makes the system less capable of producing conflicted outcomes. Advice only is about preserving an objective decision environment so that strategy can emerge from the data, not from a predetermined conclusion. Fiduciary reliability cannot rest solely on disclosure or personal restraint. It must be supported structurally. And that is why we need to talk about structure. That brings us to the capability lens. The capability lens asks one simple but powerful question. What is this system capable of producing given how it is built? Not what it promises, not what it intends, not what it advertises. What it makes likely through its structure, incentives, and constraints. This represents a fundamental shift in how we evaluate advisory models. A capability lens looks at what a system is naturally good at producing, not what its practitioners hope to deliver. Consider the term fee only. Fee only is an important disclosure about compensation. It tells us how an advisor is paid. It tells us the advisor does not receive commissions. But it does not tell us how advice is delivered. It does not tell us whether the system creates incentives around asset retention, custody, or implementation, or referrals. In a later SEC enforcement action involving a large advisory platform, regulators examined internal incentive structures rather than commissions or product sales. From the client-facing perspective, advisors were described as salaried and not compensated through commissions or product sales. Internally, however, performance evaluations, compensation, and advancement criteria incorporated metrics related to client enrollment and retention in the firm's managed account program. The issue was not a commission in the traditional sense. It was incentive architecture. Viewed through the capability lens, the concern becomes structural. The system was designed to be highly effective at producing managed account enrollment outcomes, rather than at supporting neutral analysis of whether ongoing management was appropriate for a given client. This distinction is critical for compliance and design analysis, because disclosure alone does not alter what a system is built to optimize. In many common advisory models, including AUM-based, retainer plus implementation, product-linked, referral-dependent, and platform-tethered models, the firm's operating system remains tied to influencing how advice is implemented, because that is how revenue or relational value is generated before, during, or after the advice is delivered. From a capability perspective, removing a single compensation mechanism does not change what the system is fundamentally built to produce. When advice is delivered inside a structure that benefits from implementation outcomes, the two masters problem persists by design. Advice only was engineered from the ground up to remove that chassis entirely by disconnecting compensation, monetary or non-monetary, from custody, implementation, asset levels, referrals, and all post-advice outcomes. Nearly all fee-only advisors are paid based on assets under management. They may custody assets, manage portfolios, and earn more when assets remain inside their platform and less when assets leave. From a capability perspective, that system remains optimized for asset accumulation and retention, even though commissions have been removed. Now contrast that with advice only. In an advice-only system, the advisor does not custody assets, does not manage portfolios, does not sell products, and does not receive referral compensation or monetary or non-monetary favors. The advisor is compensated transparently for the delivery of advice, and only for advice. That system is capable of recommending asset reduction when appropriate. It is capable of recommending Roth conversions that reduce account balances. It is capable of recommending mortgage payoffs. It is capable of recommending outside products. It is capable of recommending simplification. It is capable of not implementing anything at all without financial consequence to the advisor. That distinction is architectural, not merely compensatory. Let me use an analogy that I've found helpful. There have been those in the advisor community who imply that using the term advice only generically, often bundled with fee only, flat fee, fee-based, or fee-for-service labels, means the objective experience that advice only creates can be fully recreated by simply removing commissions or asset-based fees from a traditional advisory firm while leaving the underlying structure intact. That assumption is incorrect and obscures, rather than clarifies, what is required to produce genuinely deconflicted advice. Removing revenue sources does not change the system itself. It is like removing two wheels from a car. You may simplify it, you may make it lighter or cheaper, but it is still a car. It still has the same chassis, the same frame, and the same fundamental design. A modified car is not the same thing as a motorcycle engineered from the ground up for an entirely different purpose. A motorcycle is not a car with parts removed. It is fundamentally different in its design from the start. In the same way, removing commissions or asset-based fees from a traditional advisory firm does not automatically create a structurally deconflicted planning system. It removes a feature. It does not change what the system is built to optimize. It does not redesign the underlying architecture. A similar misunderstanding occurs when advisory objectivity is inferred from an upfront commitment to client self-execution. Implementation choice and advisory objectivity are not the same thing. Choosing DIY at the outset describes who will act on a recommendation, not how that recommendation was formed or what incentives shaped it. So now that we've introduced the capability lens, I want to slow down and really work with it for a few minutes, because this is where most confusion about advice models actually lives. This is where the professional conversations get muddled. This is where good advisors working in different systems talk past each other without realizing they're describing fundamentally different architectures. Remember the question the capability lens asks: what is this system capable of producing given how it is built? Let me say that again. Not what it advertises, not what the advisor intends, not what the advisor hopes to deliver. What the system itself makes likely through its structure, its incentives, and its constraints. This matters because most of the labels we use in this profession, fee-only, fiduciary, independent, describe features. They do not describe architecture. A feature is something you can add or remove. Architecture is how the building stands. Architecture is what determines what the building can do. When a firm says it is fee only, that means the advisor does not receive commissions. That is important. That is meaningful. But it does not tell us whether the advisor controls assets, manages portfolios, or is paid more when clients keep their money in one place or work with a referral partner. It doesn't tell us about the chassis. So let me walk you through a simple contrast that makes this concrete. Imagine a fee-only advisor who charges 1% of assets under management. The advisor does not sell products. They do not receive commissions. They disclose their fees clearly. They are technically compliant with all regulations. They are well-meaning, conscientious professionals. But that advisor's revenue still rises when assets go up and falls when assets go down or leave the platform. That means the system is still built around asset retention. The chassis is designed for accumulation and retention. The fee-only label describes the absence of commissions, but it doesn't describe the presence of other incentives. Now imagine an advice-only advisor. This advisor charges a fixed planning fee for delivering comprehensive financial advice. They do not custody assets. They do not manage portfolios. They do not execute trades. They do not get paid more when the client invests more. They do not get paid less when the client invests less. The fee is the same whether the client has $100,000 or $10 million. That system is built around advice delivery, not asset retention. The revenue model is disconnected from what the client does with their money after receiving the advice. So ask yourself, what kinds of recommendations will each system be naturally good at making? The AUM system will be naturally good at recommending things that keep money invested, keep money growing, keep accounts open, keep the relationship ongoing. Those recommendations might be correct, but the system has a directional bias built into its structure. The advice-only system will be naturally good at recommending whatever the math supports, even if that reduces assets, moves assets, closes accounts, or simplifies the client's financial life in ways that don't involve the advisor. That is the capability lens in action. Let me put it one more way. A system that gets paid when assets stay put will always be better at saying, "Stay invested." A system that gets paid for advice will always be better at saying, "Here is what the numbers show, regardless of what you do next." That is why advice only is not a compensation label. It is a structural one. It describes how the system is built. Advice only is not defined by which compensation methods are removed, but by whether any form of compensation, monetary or non-monetary, is conditioned on outcomes during the advice creation process. The instructional takeaway is that conflicts are properties of systems, not personalities. A capability lens evaluates what the system makes likely, not what the advisor intends. Advice only was designed in direct response to these systemic failures. Rather than attempting to disclose conflicts and manage behavior, the methodology removes the economic pathways that allow outcomes to be steered at all. When advice is economically complete at delivery, and the advisor cannot benefit from implementation choices, the system is better positioned to produce more objective outcomes. The advice-only methodology rests on three core principles: structural separation, truth in advertising, and process repeatability. Together, these principles create what I call structural objectivity, advice that is supported by system design rather than by individual restraint or intention. Structural separation means that advice is never connected to selling, managing, or holding client assets. No advice leads to an offer. No offer follows advice. Let me slow down and say that again. In a structurally separated system, The advisor does not give advice and then say, "And now let me implement that for you." That transition from advice to sales never occurs within the contracted engagement. The advice stands complete on its own. If a client decides to act on the advice, they do so with whatever providers they choose, whether that is the advisor who delivered the advice, a different advisor, an online platform, or an existing custodian. The advice does not carry an embedded implementation expectation, prerequisite, or preferred path. This is what removes the two masters problem. A common question at this point is whether an advisor who delivers an advice-only plan may later assist with implementation. This distinction matters because the methodology does not prohibit implementation. It prohibits influence during plan creation. The separation in advice only is both structural and temporal. Advice is produced inside a system fully insulated from implementation incentives. Once the plan is complete, the fiduciary obligation has been fulfilled. Only then does the client decide how or whether to act on the plan's recommendations. This design exists for three reasons. First, accessibility. A fiduciary standard that can only be practiced by a narrow subset of advisors is not a standard, it is a bottleneck. Advice only is engineered as a neutral planning system, usable by practicing fiduciaries precisely to avoid embedding predetermined implementation paths into the planning process. Second, practicality. Financial services already exist. The methodology was designed to operate within that reality while removing incentive pressure where it actually matters, during decision formation. Third, experience. Clients are not seeking theoretical purity. They are seeking judgment informed by lived professional experience. Advice only preserves that experience without monetizing the outcome. Professional experience informs the advice, but never determines how the advisor is paid for it. This is why advice only is not synonymous with DIY. DIY describes who acts. Advice only describes how recommendations are formed. The two are orthogonal. A client may choose self-execution, delegated management, or hybrid approaches after receiving an advice-only plan. The methodology itself remains neutral to that choice. Allowing clients to make their own decisions after plan completion, regardless of whether they later choose to implement independently with an outside professional or with the same advisor, does not compromise objectivity, because the objective work has already been completed. The client holds a finished plan, understands the trade-offs, and chooses how to proceed without persuasion. That separation is what creates a doubt-free experience. The client knows the advice was not shaped by how the advisor gets paid, and any subsequent implementation choice is made with clarity rather than pressure. The second core principle is truth in advertising. When this principle exists, it creates a guardrail that ensures what is said about services aligns with how those services are actually delivered. If that alignment breaks, the inconsistency becomes visible and self-enforcing. Truth in advertising means descriptive language must match operational reality. If a firm says it provides independent advice, but only works with clients who move assets onto its platform, that independence is compromised by design. If a firm claims to offer objective planning, but earns more money when clients keep assets invested, that objectivity is constrained by architecture. Truth in advertising is not about marketing compliance or regulatory phrasing. It is about whether the work performed supports the work promised. It is about whether the building can do what the sign says it does. From a practitioner's standpoint, this constraint is a feature, not a limitation. It discourages bad actors from exploiting the term by going right up to, but not crossing the line. It restores integrity to the process and shifts competition back to the quality of the work itself. If a firm is unwilling to deliver what it claims to offer, the advice-only system is simply not for them. The third principle is process repeatability. Repeatability means advice is delivered through a standardized framework, not through ad hoc persuasion or personality. A repeatable process makes advice auditable, teachable, and defensible. It allows systems to be evaluated, improved, and taught to new advisors. It ensures outcomes are not dependent on who happens to be in the room or what pressures the advisor is under that day. When advice is ad hoc or personality-driven, it becomes susceptible to hidden bias, incentive pressure, and even fatigue. Repeatability creates consistency. So how do we actually ensure that consistency? We do it through the advice-only 40-point framework. This isn't a loose philosophical guideline. It is a formal diagnostic planning system composed of approximately 40 objective checkpoints organized across 9 structured modules. From initial intake through final plan delivery, every client plan passes through these defined steps. The 40-point framework serves as the practical engine of process repeatability, reducing reliance on heroic advisor intuition and ensuring that plans are built thoroughly, transparently, and independently of downstream compensation. Together, structural separation, truth in advertising, and process repeatability create structural objectivity, advice supported by design rather than by individual heroics. Now, some of you may be thinking, I work in an asset-based model, and I give objective advice every day. I don't let my compensation influence my recommendations. And I believe you. This is not a question of integrity. It is a question of whether advisors should be required to overcome systems that quietly work against them. That burden is heavy, exhausting, and ultimately unsustainable, and it helps explain why enforcement struggles persist across the industry. Structural objectivity means you do not have to be a hero. The system itself supports the outcome you are trying to achieve. These 3 principles shift trust from the individual advisor to the architecture of the methodology. If the capability lens helps us see what a system is capable of producing, the Fee Structure Firewall is the rule that ensures advice is formed without implementation pressure. So now that we've talked about the 2 masters problem, the capability lens, and the core principles of structural separation, truth in advertising, and process repeatability, we have to talk about how those principles are actually enforced in real life. Because principles without enforcement are just ideas. Under the advice-only methodology, the enforcement mechanism is called the Fee Structure Firewall. And I want to be very clear about what that means. The Fee Structure Firewall is not a guideline. It is not a suggestion. It is not a best practice. It is a structural rule. The rule is simple. During the planning engagement, the advisor is paid only by the client for the act of giving advice, and not for implementation, product placement, asset custody, referrals, or any outcomes beyond the completion of the plan itself. Nothing, neither money, favors, future opportunities, nor implied relationships, is permitted to depend on how the plan is implemented, who implements it, or whether anything is implemented at all. Advice and money never come from the same decision. This is the central enforcement mechanism of the methodology. When advice and money depend on the same decision, conflicts are built into the system. When advice and compensation are separated, structural incentives are materially reduced by design. That is the fee structure firewall. Now let's walk through what this protects in the real world. The firewall protects 6 specific planning outcomes. Let me go through each one carefully. First, implementation independence. Implementation independence means the advisor can recommend anything without needing to be the person who executes it. Imagine a client who needs guaranteed income to cover their basic living expenses. An immediate annuity might be a perfect solution. In a traditional firm, the advisor may earn a commission on that annuity. Even if that commission is disclosed, the advisor now has a financial stake in whether the client buys it. Under the fee structure firewall, the advisor has no financial stake at all. They can say, based on your income needs and longevity risk, an annuity could make sense, and stop there. What the client does next does not affect the advisor's income. That is implementation independence. Recommendations are never influenced by whether the advisor will execute them. Second, transparent trade-off disclosure. Because the advisor's income does not depend on what the client chooses, the advisor can explain trade-offs honestly. For example, a client may be deciding whether to keep money invested or use it to pay down debt. One option might produce more long-term growth. Another might reduce risk and increase cash flow. In an asset-based model, there is pressure to keep money invested. Under the firewall, there is no such pressure. The advisor can say, here is what you gain, here is what you give up, and mean it. The advisor can fully explain the pros and cons without concern for revenue impact. Third, portfolio simplification freedom. Many firms are quietly built around complexity. More accounts, more funds, more strategies. Complexity justifies ongoing fees and makes it harder for clients to leave. The firewall breaks that. An advice-only advisor can recommend simplification. Fewer accounts, fewer funds, simpler structures, without losing income. The system is capable of saying, let's make this easier. Advice can reduce complexity or consolidate accounts without penalty. There is no gravitational pull toward complexity to justify a management fee. Fourth, incentive-independent timing decisions. Some of the most important financial decisions clients make involve timing. When to claim Social Security, when to do Roth conversions, when to start drawing from accounts, when to sell a business. In asset retention models, these decisions affect revenue. Under the firewall, they don't. They are driven by math, not money. Guidance on Social Security, Roth conversions, or asset sales is not shaped by asset retention incentives. Fifth, client-controlled professional selection. Referrals are a hidden source of bias. Even when no money changes hands, referral relationships create obligations. Under the firewall, referrals are not monetized or reciprocated. The advisor is not obligated to maintain a referral bench or steer clients toward any particular individual. Clients are free to seek recommendations from people they trust, to shop independently, or to ask the advisor to help identify qualified professionals. Because the advisor has no financial or relational stake in the outcome, any guidance given about outside professionals remains genuinely neutral. Just as importantly, the firewall prevents the advisor from becoming economically or socially dependent on outside professionals. No attorney, CPA, or manager can become a partner, because a partnership would reintroduce influence over advice. This restriction applies to external professional dependencies. It does not limit an advisor's own credentials, licensure, or professional competence. Sixth, clean engagement closure. In many firms, planning is treated as a loss leader, a preliminary step designed to convert clients into ongoing asset management or product relationships. Advice transitions to a larger ongoing sales opportunity. Under the Fee Structure Firewall, the financial advisory agreement opens when advice begins and closes when advice ends. There is no qualification or disqualification process, no upsell, no pipeline, and no conversion pressure embedded within the engagement. The planning relationship concludes cleanly, without conditioning access to care on asset size, implementation choices, or long-term retention. This changes how clients are treated. Rather than being qualified or disqualified for services based on revenue potential, clients receive the same fiduciary-grade planning regardless of whether they implement, how they implement, or who they work with afterward. Access to advice is no longer contingent on assets, relationships, or future opportunities. Clean closure is not a philosophical preference. It is a structural outcome of separating advice from implementation incentives. Using a capability lens, these outcomes can be contrasted with models where asset custody, referral compensation, or implementation fees remain embedded. The firewall does not make advisors more ethical. It removes pressures that would otherwise shape advice. These 6 protected outcomes ensure that recommendations are driven by planning logic rather than asset retention. The firewall ensures guidance is shaped by tax efficiency and client goals, not other incentives. Before we move into the 4-step process, we need to be very clear about what advice only actually produces. It does not produce tips, coaching, or instructions for self-management. It produces a fiduciary-grade financial plan, a governed set of recommendations built under duty of care using documented assumptions, modeling, and professional judgment. In this process, the advisor is responsible for evaluating what is practical, what is risky, and what will or will not work. Clients may choose to implement their plan on their own or to hire outside professionals, but that choice happens after the plan exists. Advice only is designed so that the advisor can tell the truth about what a client should do without being paid more or less depending on what the client chooses. Now let's talk about how this becomes a real client experience. The advice-only methodology is implemented through a 4-step planning process. This is not arbitrary. It is designed to align structure with fiduciary duty. The first step is always a paid consultation. There is no free sales meeting. Why does this matter? Because free meetings almost always carry an implied transaction. A paid consultation establishes that the client is buying advice. This establishes fiduciary alignment at the outset. It also makes the procurement process extremely clear, and with that, highly efficient for both advisor and client. During intake, we identify existing advisors, custodians, and data sharing practices in order to understand where influence and conflicts may exist in the client's financial ecosystem. This structural conflict screening is diagnostic, not adversarial. It is designed to map incentives and information flows without presuming misconduct or creating new pressure. Because the system is not designed to push the client toward any particular outcome, the plan is allowed to emerge naturally from the client's data, constraints, and goals. Client data is treated as fiduciary information, not as a business asset. Privacy by design principles apply from the first interaction. the advisor collects and uses client information solely for planning analysis and decision support, not for monetization, cross-selling, lead generation, or referral leverage. The methodology is designed to minimize unnecessary data exposure so that client information does not become a source of revenue, influence, or avoidable risk. The second step, present position, is a math-based snapshot of the client's entire financial life. Cash flow, assets, liabilities, taxes, insurance, risk. The goal is clarity, not persuasion. This creates a neutral baseline for decisions. The objective is clarity, not recommendation. Risks, constraints, and trade-offs are identified without steering the client toward specific products or implementation. Step 3 is where insurance, estate planning, taxes, and investments are integrated into a single financial plan, rather than treated as disconnected decisions. A central tool at this stage is total risk alignment. Traditional risk questionnaires ask how a client feels when markets move. They focus on emotional tolerance, but they miss the far more important question: how much risk the plan itself can withstand. Total risk alignment reframes risk as a survival problem, not a personality trait. Instead of asking, how much risk do you like, we ask, how much risk can this plan survive? The methodology evaluates risk across multiple dimensions: income stability, human capital exposure, longevity uncertainty, sequence of returns sensitivity, liquidity needs, tax structure, and behavioral risk. Accounts are organized by time horizon and tax character so that risk is placed where it naturally belongs, not where it happens to look good on a pie chart. This is fundamentally different from traditional risk capacity frameworks. Instead of assigning a single risk score to the entire household, the methodology treats a client's finances as a mosaic of time-segmented and tax-segmented capital. Money needed in 3 years does not share the same risk profile as money needed in 20. Tax-deferred dollars behave differently from taxable dollars. Human capital, pensions, and Social Security act as risk-absorbing anchors. Total risk alignment, therefore, allocates risk globally across the entire financial system first, and only then assigns appropriate risk levels to each pool of money. For retirees, this analysis flows directly into withdrawal strategy. The goal is not simply to maximize returns, but to support a sustainable spending plan with buffers that protect against market downturns, tax spikes, and longevity risk while still honoring estate planning goals. Step 4. Engagement completion marks the formal end of the planning engagement. If ongoing support is desired later, it occurs under a new agreement to preserve structural separation. Advice remains advice. Implementation remains the client's choice. Any post-planning support is always governed by a new agreement and the same rules of engagement under the advice-only methodology. Now that we have worked through the architecture of the advice-only methodology, the two masters problem, the capability lens, the fee structure firewall, and the 4-step planning process, we need to see how all of this plays out when real people are making real decisions. Because if a system only works in theory, it does not really work. This is where case studies help solidify things. Let me walk you through a representative case in a way that mirrors how real planning conversations actually unfold. Mark and Lisa are a married couple in their early 60s. Mark recently retired from a technology company. Lisa is still working, but plans to retire within 2 years. They have approximately $1.3 million across a traditional IRA, a Roth IRA, a taxable brokerage account, several legacy employer plans, and a home with about $190,000 remaining on the mortgage at just under 6% interest. Like many households approaching retirement, they were worried about three things: running out of money, rising healthcare costs, and taxes. Before engaging in an advice-only planning relationship, they met with several traditional firms. In every meeting, the pattern was similar. The conversation began with planning, but it quickly converged on asset consolidation. One firm proposed rolling everything into a managed portfolio. Another emphasized a proprietary investment platform. A third focused on income products and annuities. In every case, the underlying assumption was that the solution required moving their money. By the time Mark and Lisa arrived for an advice-only engagement, they felt as though they were being evaluated more as potential assets than as people. They had experienced what we call commoditization, the subtle but consistent framing of planning as a prelude to asset gathering. Their engagement began with a paid fiduciary consultation. There was no discussion of moving accounts, no proposal of products, and no presumption of implementation. The goal was simply to understand their situation. We documented their goals, constraints, concerns, and priorities, and then built what we call the present position. Every account, every income source, every liability, every tax bracket, and every future cash flow requirement. One of the first things that emerged from this analysis was that Mark and Lisa were entering what we call a tax valley. Mark had retired, but was not yet taking Social Security. Lisa's income would decline once she retired. Required minimum distributions were still more than a decade away. That created a multi-year window in which their taxable income would be significantly lower than it had been in their working years and lower than it would be later in retirement. From a planning perspective, that window is extremely valuable. We modeled a series of Roth conversions that would move assets from their traditional IRA into a Roth at historically low marginal tax rates. We analyzed how those conversions would reduce future rejected minimum distributions, lower projected Medicare premiums, and limit the taxation of Social Security benefits later in life. At the same time, we modeled Social Security claiming strategies. Delaying benefits would increase lifetime income and reduce longevity risk, while still preserving the option to claim earlier if market conditions or health changed. The Fee Structure Firewall separates advice from implementation so strategies can be evaluated purely on their mathematical and planning merit. There was no pressure to favor asset retention, product placement, or account consolidation. The analysis was driven by tax timing, cash flow stability, and the survivability of the plan. The Roth strategy, however, created a practical challenge. Mark and Lisa still needed to live while taxable income was being intentionally increased for conversion purposes. Under the total risk alignment framework, we examined how to fund those years without introducing unnecessary market or tax risk. Rather than drawing from their retirement accounts during the conversion window, the plan called for them to utilize their taxable brokerage accounts for supplemental income. Those accounts already reflected prior tax loss harvesting and relatively low effective basis, which meant withdrawals could be taken with limited tax impact. This preserved tax-deferred accounts for later years, when required minimum distributions and higher tax brackets would matter more, and created a larger buffer against early retirement market downturns. In an asset retention chassis, there is little incentive to coordinate Roth strategy, liquidity, and sequence of returns risk this way. Under advice only, this outcome simply reflects how the system aligns tax timing, account location, and survivability across the entire plan. We also evaluated their mortgage in the same framework. Paying it off reduced required cash flow, and lowered the amount of portfolio risk the plan needed to carry in the first decade of retirement. That decision was evaluated alongside the Roth and withdrawal strategy as part of a single integrated system. Finally, we simplified their account structure by consolidating legacy plans where appropriate, reducing complexity without creating any new custody, product, or revenue relationships. When the final plan was delivered, Mark and Lisa did not open new accounts or move assets to the advisor. Execution of the strategy occurred through the custodial platforms, employer-sponsored plans, and third-party providers they already used, without introducing any new custody, management, or revenue relationships. What they received was not a sales relationship. It was a coherent, fiduciary-grade strategy they could understand, verify, and control. Mark and Lisa chose to implement the plan through their existing providers, with professional execution, but that was a client decision, not a requirement of the advice-only methodology. In other cases, an advice-only plan might recommend outside management, annuities, or delegated investment solutions if those better serve the client's objectives. The defining feature is that the planning system remains neutral to how the plan is executed. Mark and Lisa left with a plan they understood, options they controlled, and a strategy that belonged to them, not a sense of being qualified or disqualified for services. This case illustrates structural objectivity in action, a plan engineered for survivability, tax efficiency, and clarity, free from implementation pressure. And when implementation pressure is removed, something subtle but important happens for the client. Avoidable doubt disappears. Mark and Lisa didn't wonder whether the mortgage payoff recommendation was influenced by asset retention incentives or product considerations. The reasoning stood on its own. That experience, where conclusions feel clear because motives are structurally irrelevant, is what we describe as doubt-free planning. Regulatory enforcement history reinforces the core premise of this course. Many firms have not been sanctioned because they failed to disclose conflicts, but because disclosed conflicts continued to influence recommendations through compensation, promotion, or retention structures. Disclosure did not neutralize incentives because the underlying architecture remained intact. These enforcement patterns show that fiduciary reliability depends on system design, not disclosure alone. A system can be transparent and still biased if its incentives remain outcome dependent. Fiduciary duty, therefore, extends beyond compensation structure into how knowledge itself is handled. Epistemic fiduciary duty requires that advice be grounded in evidence rather than marketing appeal, convenience, or precedent. Under the advice-only methodology, strategies are evaluated through a knowledge filtering process that emphasizes regulatory guidance, empirical research, internal consistency, and repeatability across client circumstances. Under this framework, reliability depends more on system design than on individual discretion. The reliability of advice does not depend on the advisor's restraint or virtue, but on whether the system itself filters, constrains, and tests recommendations before they reach the client. Advice only is a defined fiduciary planning architecture that produces outcome-neutral financial strategies under structural conflict control. A model that presumes a specific implementation path, including DIY, before analysis is just as outcome biased as a model that presumes product sales. For clarity, advice only is not a DIY model. Implementation choices are client decisions made only after advice is complete. It is not financial coaching. It is not software supplemented by access to a CFP. It is not a developmental stage of advisory practice. It is a deliberately closed fiduciary system designed to end planning engagements without economic dependency on outcomes. Under this methodology, the advisor retains full professional responsibility for evaluating what is realistic, what is risky, and what is likely or unlikely to work. Recommendations are formed independently of product sales, asset management, referral incentives, or implementation outcomes. Clients may choose to implement their plan on their own or with outside professionals, but only after advice has been fully formed inside a structurally neutral system. Implementation choices, including DIY execution or third-party asset management, are client decisions. They are not features of the advice-only methodology itself. By examining structural conflicts, the capability lens, the fee structure firewall, and real-world application, this course demonstrates that fiduciary reliability can be engineered, not merely promised. The instructional portion of this course is now complete. CFP professionals seeking CE credit must complete the assessment and attest to having viewed or listened to the full program. Thank you for your commitment to objective financial planning.